History remembers Vlad III as a ruler of immense power. But few know the real story of how he died, alone, decaying, and ultimately human. He was the Impaler, the son of the dragon. A man whose very name would echo through the centuries, distorted into something monstrous, Dracula. To his enemies, he was a nightmare, a prince who staked thousands, who lined roads with the corpses of his foes, who ruled Wallachia with an iron fist and a blood-stained throne. To his people? A protector. A tyrant, yes, but a necessary one. A man who brought justice, however cruel. A ruler forged in the crucible of Ottoman captivity, political betrayal, and endless war. But behind the myth, behind the fanged legend that would inspire horror for generations, there was still a man. And like all men, he would die. Not in battle, surrounded by glory. Not with the defiance of a monster, unyielding to the last breath. But in confusion. In fear. In betrayal. In decay. The death of Vlad III is a story largely shrouded in mystery, fractured between folklore and fragments of truth. And that is precisely what makes it terrifying. Because the man who terrified empires was not spared the terror of his own end. This is not the Dracula of novels. This is not the Impaler of legend. This is the final descent of a once mighty ruler. The body, the mind, the kingdom, all turning against him. This is the story of how power fades, how myth unravels, and how death, brutal, banal, and inescapable, claims even the most feared of men. Vlad III's final battle did not take place on a battlefield, but within his own body. In the annals of medieval horror, Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, stands alone. His early life was defined by captivity, brutality, and blood. His rule over Wallachia was marred by conflict with nobles, invaders, and traitors. He survived imprisonment, exile, and assassination attempts. And yet, in the end, it would not be swords or fire that undid him. It began, not with a wound, but with a whisper. By the late 1470s, Vlad had clawed his way back to the throne of Wallachia for a third time. His enemies were many, the encroaching Ottoman Empire, rival claimants to his crown, and the very boyars who had betrayed his father. But time had changed him. Accounts speak of a man hardened even further, more erratic, more paranoid. Where once his cruelty had a ruthless logic, now it bordered on madness. Villages were punished for the faintest suspicion of disloyalty. Spies were seen everywhere. Executions became daily rituals, not political tools but symptoms of a man unraveling. His physical health, too, had begun to wane. Though detailed records are scarce, there are hints, aches that would not subside, unexplainable fevers, violent outbursts of temper followed by moments of eerie silence. Some modern historians suspect he suffered from a degenerative illness, perhaps aggravated by years of trauma and stress. Others suggest lead poisoning, from the ornate goblets and cosmetics of the time, could have eroded his sanity. But what's certain is this: the Vlad who returned to the throne was not the same man who once impaled an entire army and stood unshaken. He was no longer invincible. By this point, his relationship with the Hungarian court had frayed. Though Matthias Corvinus had once supported Vlad's cause, the alliance was now one of convenience at best. Letters from the period hint at a growing isolation. Vlad's court was smaller, quieter, filled with sycophants rather than allies. And rumors began to circulate, among peasants, among nobles, even in the corridors of foreign courts. That the Impaler was slipping. That his judgment had dulled. That the monster was beginning to die, not from a blade, but from the inside out. The man who had once ruled through fear now feared everything. He ordered his food tested by servants. He refused to sleep in the same room twice. He would speak to no one without a drawn weapon at his side. There are whispers that he began seeing figures no one else could see, ghosts of the impaled, faces of the betrayed. Hallucinations? Or the inevitable return of the guilt he had buried beneath a mountain of corpses? His final campaign, against the Ottomans, was as reckless as it was desperate. He pushed into enemy territory with a smaller, ill-equipped force, convinced of betrayal within his own court. Some accounts say he marched toward death intentionally, unable to bear the slow erosion of power and self. Others suggest he was tricked, led into a trap by those closest to him. In either case, the line between fate and choice had blurred. The man who once controlled his destiny with iron and fire now found himself powerless, pulled toward an ending he couldn't stop. His final battle would not be glorious. It would not be remembered in songs. It began, as many deaths do, not with blood, but with silence. The silence of allies growing distant. Of loyalists turning cold. Of a mind cracking under its own weight. The silence before the end. His mind began to betray him. Vlad III's reign was built on fear. But in his final days, fear consumed him. The collapse came quietly, then all at once. What began as paranoia, harmless, perhaps even expected of a ruler surrounded by treachery, soon twisted into obsession. Every servant was a potential spy. Every knock at the door a prelude to betrayal. The very walls of his stronghold seemed to close in on him. He demanded his food be burned black to kill imagined poisons. He drank only from his own cup, and even then, not without first forcing a trusted guard to sip from it. Contemporary sources suggest a haunting presence in his final months, a man haunted not by enemies, but by memory. They say he would walk the corridors of his keep at night, sword unsheathed, speaking to the air. Some swore they heard him whisper names, enemies, lovers, his own father. Some say he was reliving his past horrors, or apologizing for them. And yet, in the midst of this crumbling sanity, Vlad's physical form held on, but not without cost. His body showed signs of strain. Unexplained lesions appeared on his skin, and chronic pain stiffened his joints. He reportedly kept his face veiled in the presence of others, perhaps to hide swelling, perhaps because he feared they might read the fear in his eyes. There are accounts of him trembling during council meetings, his fingernails clawing at the armrest of his throne until they bled. Some chroniclers speak of moments of absolute stillness, where Vlad would stare at nothing for minutes on end. Then, just as suddenly, he would rise in a fury, screaming of plots, of ghosts in armor, of blood not yet repaid. If modern medicine were to examine these signs, one might suspect late-stage syphilis, or a neurological condition brought on by years of head trauma and stress. Others believe it was psychosis, the final unspooling of a man who had carried too much horror for one soul to bear. There were darker signs, too. In the weeks before his death, he had his horses slaughtered and buried. He insisted their spirits were conspiring against him. He forced loyal retainers to stand vigil over empty rooms, watching for invisible assassins. He accused his own cooks of conspiracy and executed them, only to beg for their forgiveness hours later. He began to isolate himself completely, locking himself in a stone chamber that had once been used to imprison Ottoman captives. A twisted irony, the jailer now caged by his own mind. And perhaps the most chilling account of all, a servant claimed to find him one morning surrounded by rows of impaled birds. Enemies, he had muttered. They were listening. By now, the legend had outgrown the man. Rumors circulated that Vlad could no longer distinguish the living from the dead. That he bathed in blood to stave off illness. That he spoke to the corpses of the impaled, asking them for counsel. We may never know what was true. But what is clear is this: the man who built his empire by mastering fear was now ruled by it. His body remained upright. His sword still gleamed. But behind his eyes, there was only decay. And though he was still feared by his enemies, he had become a stranger to his friends, and to himself. The fall of Vlad the Impaler did not come with fire and fanfare. It came slowly, cruelly, through a mind that dissolved into shadows. And in that darkness, the legend began to rot. As Vlad suffered, the world around him moved on, or prepared to replace him. No man rules forever. And in the fractured, blood-stained politics of 15th century Wallachia, even the most feared ruler was never more than a heartbeat away from being replaced. As Vlad III's grip weakened, on his court, his kingdom, and his mind, others began to circle. The Hungarian crown, once his reluctant ally, had already begun to hedge its bets. Matthias Corvinus, who had both supported and imprisoned Vlad in the past, knew well the danger of backing a dying lion. While Vlad's correspondence grew more erratic and his demands more desperate, Hungarian envoys turned their attention to younger, more controllable candidates for Wallachia's throne. Among them was Basarab Lyota, Vlad's longtime rival, a man who had already claimed the throne once and was eager to do so again. He offered loyalty to the Ottomans in exchange for power, a move that made him far more attractive to both foreign powers and Wallachian boyars, who were tired of Vlad's reign of fear. The nobility, too, sensed the end. Those who had once feared the stake now held secret meetings in dimly lit halls, their loyalty for sale to the highest bidder. Many of the same boyars who had bowed and scraped before Vlad in his prime were now quietly reaching out to his enemies. Some even went further, actively feeding misinformation to Vlad, accelerating his descent into paranoia. Within his own household, trust evaporated. His guards rotated frequently, either because Vlad no longer trusted them, or because they were defecting in droves. Those who remained were not loyalists, but opportunists, waiting for the moment he would fall so they could carve out a piece of what remained. Even family offered no sanctuary. His wife, whose identity remains debated by historians, possibly a relative of the Hungarian king, was reportedly kept at a distance. Whether out of fear for her safety or fear of Vlad himself is unclear. His children, if they were alive and near, were kept far from the epicenter of the storm. There is no record of them visiting in his final days. And the people? The people of Wallachia were quiet. Too quiet. The once loud tales of Vlad's gruesome justice, the impalements, the mass executions, the terrifying punishments, began to sound like old stories. In the countryside, they whispered of a king who had gone mad. In the towns, they speculated on who would rule next. No one mourned his silence. No one asked after him. The once golden aura of invincibility had corroded. The land that had trembled under his fist now seemed almost relieved to feel his grip loosening. And yet, perhaps the cruelest twist of all, Vlad was not dead yet. He was very much alive. Alive and watching. Watching as the machine he had built, through blood, terror, and merciless control, slipped from his hands, piece by piece. This was not a clean fall. It was a slow rot. A decay not only of body and mind, but of legacy. He had ruled through fear. And now, in his most vulnerable hour, no one feared him enough to protect him. Vlad III, who had spent his life mastering the shadows, found himself abandoned in them. The world outside his walls kept turning. Courts plotted. Rivals gathered. The future of Wallachia was being decided, and it no longer included him. History rarely pauses for the dying. And for the man called Dracula, there would be no exception. By the time death came, it was a mercy. No battlefield. No warhorse. No trumpet of triumph or mourning. When Vlad III met death, it was not with glory, but with confusion, violence, and a sickening silence. The final hours of Vlad the Impaler are shrouded in contradiction. Some say he died alone. Others claim a violent ambush. A few even suggest a tragic case of mistaken identity. What is certain, however, is that his death was anything but noble. By the winter of 1476, his enemies had outmaneuvered him. Ottoman-backed forces, possibly in league with treacherous Wallachian nobles, had launched a final push to unseat him. Vlad rallied what men he could, his mind still burning with desperate strategy. But the numbers were against him, and the betrayal too deep. It is said that during a minor skirmish on the outskirts of Bucharest, Vlad was ambushed, or perhaps led into a trap by those he still thought loyal. There are two competing accounts of his death, both equally unsettling. In one, his own men killed him, confusing him for an enemy soldier in the fog and chaos of battle. A quick mistake. A sword to the back. A head separated from the body. The irony of a prince of precision and paranoia falling to friendly error. In the other, darker version, he was captured alive. Stripped of armor. Spat upon by soldiers who had once feared his name. Tortured, briefly, efficiently. Then executed. A head taken as proof, his body dumped in a shallow grave. But what happened before that moment is even more haunting. Witnesses claimed Vlad, in his last moments, did not scream or plead. He simply stared. Not with rage. Not with terror. But with something close to emptiness. He had seen death in every form imaginable, had authored it. Perhaps when it finally came for him, it felt inevitable. Familiar. A long-time companion returning at last. His body, once so feared, was desecrated. His head was reportedly preserved in honey and sent to the Sultan in Constantinople, where it was displayed on a spike for all to see. Dracula, reduced to a trophy. And yet, even in death, he unsettled those who saw him. One chronicler described his severed face as frozen in thought, as though still planning revenge. Others said his eyes seemed to follow them. There was no funeral. No public mourning. No last rites recorded. Just a corpse, possibly burned, possibly buried in an unmarked pit, forgotten by the very land he had once ruled with fire and iron. In the end, he died as all men do, helpless, alone, and stripped of illusion. No stake. No throne. No control. Just flesh, fear, and the slow erasure of power. For all his horrors, all his conquests, all his calculated cruelty, the final moment of Vlad III's life was heartbreakingly simple. He died. And in doing so, reminded the world, even monsters bleed. The story of their death was rewritten, or buried. Vlad III may have died in blood and humiliation, but that is not how history chose to remember him. His death was too inconvenient. Too brutal. Too human. And so, it was reshaped, shaved down, reworked, obscured. The political climate in Wallachia after his death was fragile. His enemies needed legitimacy. His supporters needed a myth. And the common people, exhausted by war and fear, needed closure. What they got was a ghost story, not a eulogy. The first thing to vanish was the body. To this day, the exact location of Vlad's remains is unknown. Some claim he was buried at the Snagov monastery, but when archaeologists opened the supposed tomb in the 20th century, they found nothing but animal bones. Others believe he was interred anonymously to prevent desecration, or perhaps he was never buried at all. Next came the silencing of witnesses. Those who had seen his final days, or who might have contradicted the legend, were erased. Chroniclers who dared speak of his madness or defeat were ignored or discredited. Only the stories that fit the image of the cold, immortal warlord were allowed to survive. In time, Vlad's memory was not just protected, it was curated. Wallachian nationalists in later centuries would revive him as a hero, a defender of Christian Europe against the Ottoman tide. His atrocities were reframed as necessity. His cruelty, called unyielding strength. His fall, dismissed as the result of betrayal, not decay. And then came the foreign storytellers. German pamphlets painted him as a demon in human form. Ottoman writers, eager to justify their hatred, described atrocities so grotesque they bordered on the surreal, infants impaled on their mothers' breasts, banquets among rotting corpses. Truth blurred into horror. Horror blurred into legend. By the 19th century, the man had all but vanished, replaced by a monster. Then came Bram Stoker. In 1897, with a single novel, Vlad III was reborn. Not as a prince, not even as a tyrant, but as something supernatural. Dracula. An undead predator. Eternal. The transformation was complete. The real man, mad, betrayed, and mutilated in some muddy field, was gone. And in his place stood a myth no longer bound by flesh or failure. This was not accidental. It was intentional forgetting. Because the true end of Vlad the Impaler is not the story empires want to tell. It is too ugly. Too uncertain. Too filled with silence and shadows. And so, his final breath was replaced by a hiss. His death mask overwritten with fangs. His grave lost to time. The state didn't need to forge a monument. It only needed to let time rot the truth and feed the myth. And it worked. Today, most remember Dracula, not Vlad. The vampire, not the man. The immortal monster, not the decaying corpse. His power was restored, not through empire, but through legend. Not through truth, but through fear. The same fear he had once wielded in life. And perhaps, that's exactly what he wanted. Vlad III's life may have commanded armies, but his death speaks of something more universal: decay, memory, and the limits of power. Vlad the Impaler's life was a brutal testament to the extremes of power, ruthless, terrifying, unyielding. Yet, in death, he reveals a far deeper truth about the human condition and the fragility of authority. No matter how many enemies he impaled or how many castles he ruled, Vlad could not escape the slow undoing of flesh and mind. His death reminds us that beneath the layers of legend and fear lies a man bound by the same laws as any other: mortality, vulnerability, and inevitable decline. His story, twisted, sanitized, mythologized, also reflects the way history treats its fallen giants. We erase the uncomfortable details. We replace complexity with caricature. We build myths to fill the silence left by death. But those myths, for all their power, can never fully conceal the raw, human reality beneath. In Vlad's case, death became the great equalizer. A mirror held up not just to a man, but to a world where power is fleeting, and fear is a double-edged sword. As the Latin phrase warns, memento mori, remember you must die. No matter how much we impale, imprison, or intimidate, death's shadow falls equally on all. And in that truth, Vlad III's terrifying final days speak louder than any legend. They remind us not just of a ruthless prince, but of ourselves, our fears, our frailties, and the unyielding limits of power.